Frank, I'd like to start out by asking you to describe your father to me. What kind of man was he?
He was a feisty person. He was short in stature and...
I'm sorry, could you start by saying my father?
Oh.
So we identify who.
Well, my father was short in stature and weight was about average, I would imagine, and he was feisty. He had a mind of his own and had a short fuse a lot of times, I understand. And
what about your mother? Can you describe your mother to me?
well, my mother was a caring person, and there's not much more I can say other than that. She had 10 kids, and she liked children, I suppose. We got along very well. Very little dissension with my mother.
When you, at the time, there were only, could you describe what your family was at the time in 1932?
In 1932, there were just 6 in the family at that time. And that was the year we went to Washington, D.C., in the bonus army.
How did you find out you were going to Washington, D.C.? Do you remember?
No, I was very young at the time, 9 years old. Father came home one day and said to my mother, "Pack up the kids, we're going to Washington, D.C. for the bonus army." And they herded us into the car, and he painted some signs on the side of it, and we waved goodbye to the neighbors and took off. And that was it.
How did your mother prepare for this? What did she bring along?
Like I say, I don't recall. I imagine we took extra clothing, and I don't think she had any idea of what she was really getting into, and I don't really recall whether we took, cooking utensils or anything with us at the time.
Do you remember your trip to Washington? Can you give me your impressions of that trip?
I don't remember so much. I remember leaving the neighborhood and just traveling, and of course, with 5 kids in the back seat, traveling all that distance, I don't recall much of the trip itself. I know when we got to Washington, D.C., we was in a big field at the time with a few tents up and some lean-tos and shacks, and that's about all I remember.
Can you describe the camps to me? The smells, the sights, the sounds. What if you could go in a time machine? What would it look like?
Well, it was a hodgepodge of tents and shacks, no structure to it at all. I mean, you didn't have roadways or streets or anything. Just that wherever there was a spot to set up a lean-to or a tent or something, it was done in that manner. And being 9 at the time, I was only so tall, and of course I was in amongst a lot of adults, and there wasn't much to do. Just we lived in a tent. We had I guess they'd call it a 6-man tent, and we stayed around the tent most of the time, and would wander off, but not far.
Okay, can we cut for a second? What I wanted to ask you about is where was your, now you don't have to be specific about the place, but where was your campsite located?
We were right next to the river. I guess the river was maybe 50 yards from our tent, and of course there was a bridge going across the river in the area we were tented. There was no shore to speak of. There was a stone wall next to the river that we could sit on the stone wall and sit over on the edge of it. Our feet wouldn't touch the water. We were that high off the water of the wall. As a matter of fact, there was a boat that moored right there along the wall, and we got on that boat one time and walked around. I guess it was another veteran that came up in his boat, I suppose, to join the Army.
Do you remember what the mood of the veterans were? What they, how, how determined were they? Were they angry? Were they upset? What was their mood?
I would imagine, and from listening to my father, they were upset. They felt that they were entitled to the bonus, and they decided to make an issue of it, I suppose, and they went to Washington, D.C. to see what could be done. And as for the men in the camp, I guess they had a common cause. They all felt that they were entitled to something, and I guess Congress wasn't moving on it, and so they decided to show some force or strength in uniting together and going as a common cause.
Could you tell me, you told a really nice story about the working for the Red Cross worker. Could you tell me that story?
Could you just move your glasses back up, sir?
There was an aid station there, and there was a woman in charge of it, and I don't know whether she was a nurse or not, but it was a Red Cross, I assume it was a Red Cross station. And just to have something to do, she gave us these small bottles. We would take, and she'd put a little bit of water in the bottom of it, and then we'd take these real fine pieces of gravel, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 of them, and drop them down in the bottle and put the cap on it and shake the bottle back and forth to clean out the residue inside, because they were bottles that were discarded in dumps or some other places, I suppose. And after we'd get them cleaned out, she would take and boil them and sterilize them, and then they would put medication in some of them for people that needed any type of medication that they could furnish. Because, you were living down there day in and day out, and people would get cut or bruises or bumps or maybe a little dysentery, I don't know. But that was the purpose of it. And everybody seemed to cooperate together with one another, and don't recall any squabbles that anybody ever had.
There were reports of communists in the camp. Do you remember anything like that?
No.
Physically, how would you get water? How would you get?
We used to carry the water. We had 5-gallon containers, and there was a central location where there was a spigot, I suppose. And we would go take the containers up to where the spigot was, and we'd fill these containers up, and then one of my sisters or my younger brother would carry the water back. We used to take a board or slat and run it through the 2 handles so that 2 people could carry it at the same time, and then we'd carry it back to our tent, where my mother used it for cooking and for washing and different things.
Now, how did you prepare your food?
Well, we had the tent, and outside the tent there was a small stove, which was a wood stove with a chimney, and there were wooden crates that were piled up alongside the stove that my mother would break up, or the kids would break up, and then she'd throw that in the stove, and then she'd cook on top of that with some pots and pans or skillets or whatever. Be a lot of soup, I know, because you had a lot of mouths to feed, so there was plenty of soup.
The men would pass the time. How would the men pass their time?
Well, if they weren't down at the Capitol and demonstrating down there, there were areas that were set up. There was, I recall, one long tent that had the sides rolled up, and there were some tables and a whole row of tables, and guys would play chess or checkers or cards, and people would stand around and watch, or they would get into a game of checkers. And I've played checkers as a kid with adults on several occasions. it helped to pass the time.
Okay, let's cut for a second. Speed? Well, Frank, could you go on, excuse me, and tell me what the environment of the camp, what the climate was, what the temperature, the look of the camp was during those hot months?
Well, it was hot and dry, I recall. I don't recall it raining very often. I imagine we did have some days where it did rain, but I don't recall offhand. The thing stands out in my mind most of all is that after walking over these areas day in and day out with all these people, that finally the dust, the dirt had started to pulverize, like, and got in very fine dust, and it would get hot when you walked across it in bare feet. Because we didn't wear shoes that often when we were there in the camp. It was casual dress. I mean, pants and shirt, and no need for shoes because it wasn't dress-up time. It was kind of a relaxed atmosphere for the kids. But I do recall that the dust being hot underfoot and being very fine and pulverized. So I don't recall it raining and getting mucky and wet, but it was hot and humid sometimes. We'd roll the sides of the tents up during the day and let the air circulate through the tents.
Hold on a second.
What kind of shacks did people have? What did they make them out of?
Corrugated metal or wood,
Could you start by
canvas.
saying the shacks that people built, or some way of identifying it?
It basically was just some place to get in out of the weather. A lot of them were just small where they would just have enough headroom to get in and maybe sleep on the ground in a blanket or something. But they were assorted sizes, and of course they go out and scrounge out some corrugated metal or something and make lean-tos out of that. But like I say, any place that they found a spot where they could set up something, they did, and that was their home away from home, for the evenings anyway. And I imagine they did a lot of walking down to the Capitol to demonstrate.
Can you just say they made their shacks out of? Could you start out by saying that they? Because I need you to say the word shacks or places that they stayed, just to identify what we're talking about.
Well, they were shacks. I mean, they weren't constructed out of 2x4s like you'd build a house. I mean, it was just any piece of wood that they could get nailed together and that would hold up. And they were just shacks and made out of any material that they.
Can you describe the shacks again? But tell me about the signs and that sort of thing.
Well, they were all different sizes, assorted sizes, and they would paint signs depicting where they came from, the state they came from, or the city, and of course they had slogans, and they had different sayings that they wanted to bonus, and they were entitled to it, and there was different slogans that they had painted on anything that would suit the purpose of the sign, and that was about the size of it.
Well, what?
Can we cut for a second?
What kind of expressions did the marchers, did the bonus people make about Hoover?
Well, it wasn't well liked, I'll say that. They felt that he was responsible for not getting the bonus, and so they had to pick on somebody, and I guess he was the most logical person, and they didn't care much for him as president.
Could you start out by saying the president, or include the president in your response, so people know who you're talking about? So Frank, what was the expression toward the president at this time?
Well, they felt that the president was at fault, that the didn't push for the bonus that they wanted to get and they thought they were entitled to. And I suppose being the commander-in-chief, they felt that he was responsible and something should have been done. And they felt that perhaps he wasn't doing enough.
What kind of, if you were sitting on the bank of the river on that wall, what would you see down the Potomac?
There wasn't just the river itself. There wasn't much to see, and just the water rolling by. And this one particular boat that I'd mentioned before was tied up at the wall there, and that was the extent of it.
Would you see people like washing in the river and stuff like that?
No, because like I say, we were at a point where the river came right up against the wall. There was no shoreline at all to speak of, and so whether they used the river to wash in or not, I have no idea.
How did you get clean?
Well, we carried water down to the...
Sir, can you start that again? Start your answer.
Just start your answer. How did you get clean?
We would carry the water in the 5-gallon cans down to the tent, and of course my mother would heat the water, and we would take galvanized tubs and, well, one particular tub and set it in the tent, and then she'd pour the hot water in there and mix it with the cold water, and we would get in these tubs to take a bath. That's how we bathed. There was no central showers anywhere that I knew of, and that's how we took our baths.
Could you tell me your story of the eviction, and please include in it the reaction of your father and mother?
Well, as I recall, my father was away from the tent, came back and told my mother that they were going to march on the Capitol. They was going to march in force. And, of course, my mother was a little upset about it because word got around that they were going to call out the Army and disperse the people at these camps and get them out of Washington, D.C. So she was kind of upset about that and loaded us all in the car, and we went up the hill to the bridge, started to go across the bridge, and when we got almost to the other side, there was the Army with their horses and their soldiers with their bayonets and the tanks. And old Doug MacArthur was standing out there in front, said we couldn't go over, that we had to disperse and leave Washington, D.C. So we stayed there for a short period of time, I guess, and my father, I guess, got out and conferred with other men and see what they were going to do. And my father came back to the car. We turned the car around, and we came back and tore down our tent and loaded up the car and left the area. And we drove to a spot I don't recall where it was at. I do know that there was an outdoor swimming pool and a bathhouse that was adjacent to the pool. No lights. We stayed there at this, I guess it was a park, all night, slept in the car, and in the morning my father had gone and conferred with somebody else, and when he came back he says, well, we're going home. They've decided to disperse, and that was it. So we started back towards Pittsburgh.
I'd like to ask you about your own personal reactions when you saw that bridge.
Well, everyone was excited because my mother was a little excited, and she was apprehensive, I suppose you could say. Didn't know what was going to happen because most of the men were pretty well upset. They figured they had to make a stand, and they were going to make a stand, and I guess they were going to defy the Army. And I was going to have no parts of it, I suppose. And my mother knew this, and she was concerned about the kids because there were 6 of us in the car, and I guess she was worried about our safe being. And but when we started across the bridge and I saw these soldiers, and I've never I'd never seen tanks and soldiers on horses and soldiers with bayonets before, and and my father was pretty headstrong. I didn't know whether he was going to try to go through them or not, but it was frightening. And I remember very well. It was something I'll never forget.
Thanks, that's good. Speed. Could you tell me that story about going to the dairy?
Well, the people in Washington, D.C. Would supply things to the Bonus Army, the different companies, and one day I had an opportunity to ride in the truck. I think my father was going down to a dairy in Washington, D.C., where they would donate milk, and all we had to do was load it on the truck and take it back to the camp, and of course it was distributed throughout the camp. And I recall going down there, and we pulled up to this dairy, and there was a loading dock there with these cases of milk stacked one on top of another next to the building on the dock, and got out of the truck and walked up to the loading dock, and this one man gave me a bottle of chocolate milk. And he said, "Here, son, here's some chocolate milk for you." And I was delighted to get that. Opened the lid and took a gulp of the chocolate milk and found out it was sour. So I remember that quite well. But the people down there were good to the men or the people in the Bonus Army. We get baked goods and stuff. If you recall years ago, that like I said before, that they didn't have the preservatives in food that we have today, and any bakery goods that you got was always half price if it was a day old, and I guess they went down and they would buy up some of that and bring it back. So I don't recall ever going hungry and never missing a meal. Of course, my mother cooked for us, and there were field kitchens where they cooked for the men who were by themselves. I'd see them line up with their mess kits and get their portions dealt out to them.
Okay, that's great. There was a guy who built a wooden dock.
Well, in the evening there wasn't much to do, and around dusk, they would gather around and swap stories. And one thing I remember, that the man had a big spike about that big, and he claimed that he could bend it into a horseshoe. And they would, if I was standing around, didn't think that he could do it, and they were taking bets on the side, and this guy grunted and groaned, and finally he took this thing and had two handkerchiefs that went on either side, and he bent that thing into a U, looked like a horseshoe. And, the other thing I remember, that there was a fellow that did some wood carving, and he made a little mannequin about so tall that had the arms that swung back and forth, and the knees were jointed, the legs were jointed so that they would move back and forth. And he took this little board and he would slip it on the seat he was sitting on under his leg, and he took this little mannequin that had a stick that he held it with, and he would tap on this board, and he'd get this little mannequin to dance, and he would dance, and his feet would bounce up and down, and the arms would swing back and forth, and that was quite entertaining. I enjoyed that. I remember that very well.
Okay, that's good. That's great. Thanks. What special thing did your father do to get his point across?
Of course, like I said, he wrote on the side of the car when we left our neighborhood, and said he was going to Washington, D.C. for the Bonus Army. When we got down to Washington, D.C. and set up the tent, he decided to make a sign and then have a photograph made of the sign with my mother and my brothers and sisters standing out in front of the tent, so that he could make a point, and this was his issue, and this was the reason for him to be in Washington, D.C., that he wanted his bonus. So he had a postcard made up, and had several of them printed, and they were passed out. And anybody that wanted to contribute any money towards the postcard and help out, I was gladly accepted any contributions. So that was the extent of it.
Well, we're
Let's cut it.
okay. So Frank? Tell me, what special thing did your father do?
Well, when we got to Washington, D.C. and set up the tent, and he decided to make a sign because I think everybody was making signs on why they wanted the bonus. So my father lined us all up in front of the tent and had this little handmade sign made and set it out in front of us and had somebody take a shot of it, and he had copies made of it, and this was his reason for the bonus, and this was his way of saying it. And it shows my father and my mother and my brothers and sisters all in a little row there. I'm in the middle. And it showed us our lifestyle and how we cooked on the stove. You can see a picture of that on the right here. This stack is the stove that my mother cooked on, and over here on the far left where the two pans are, that's that used as a kitchen where she washed the dishes and the pots and pans out there. And there's a fence in the background with two galvanized buckets hanging on the wall. The larger one was the bathtub. And of course there's the ice box that's sitting there underneath the little piece of canvas, lean-to like. And when we were lucky enough to get ice, that kept the things cold. And so that was our style of living. And of course, here on the far right is the car that we drove to Washington, D.C. in. And you can see a flag in the background there, American flag. There were a lot of those up because it was a patriotic thing to do, I suppose. And we used to take these and pass them around, and this was my father's statement on why he wanted the bonus. And it says that Pittsburgh, PA, this is my 6 reasons for wanting the bonus.
What does it say in the back?
Well, they had this printed on the back, and I hope it doesn't offend any Christians, but it's the 23rd Psalm with Hoover's name on it, and it reads, Hoover is my shepherd, I am in want, he maketh me to lie on the cold ground. He disturbeth my soul, he lead me in the path of destruction for his party's sake. Yea, though I walk through the shadow of depression, I anticipate no recovery, for Hoover is with me. He prepareth a reduction in the presence of mine enemies. He anointeth my small income with taxes. My expenses runneth over. Surely unemployment will follow me all of Hoover's term, and I will dwell in a car on the road forever. Amen.
Great. Let's cut. Frank, earlier on, before you went on the march, you said you moved into the city.
Mm-hmm.
What did you notice when you moved into the city? What did you see?
Indoor plumbing, if that counts for anything. When I was very young, we lived on a farm, and we had no conveniences at all, and that includes electricity or running water. We had a well with a pump and no central heating.
I mean, when you said your father was always working, but you noticed something. Can you describe what? Could you start by saying that my father was always working, but?
Well, my father had a job all during the Depression. He worked in a movie theater, and he ran the machines that projected the pictures on the screen. So therefore, he worked when other people weren't working. I did notice a difference when we moved to the city, that there were people that weren't working and were out of work because there was no jobs to be had, and they had to scrimp and save to get by. Of course, we did too. With 6 kids, it wasn't an easy matter. And money didn't stretch that far in those days, so therefore you was very conservative in what you did and in your dress, and our basic food was a lot of soups, I recall, because that was the cheapest way to go. And like I mentioned before, when we were in Washington, D.C., we walked around without shoes, and we did that too after we moved to the city. In the summertime, you ran around in your bare feet a good bit of the time because you saved the shoes for dress up or for school. And people had dress clothes and they had play clothes, and you never played in your dress clothes, and you never went to school or church in your play clothes. So. But it was, I recall, there was one or two families that did without electricity because they couldn't pay the bill and had their service terminated, and so it was tough living. I didn't notice so much as a kid. My parents used to talk about it, and I'd hear older people talking about trying to find work and not able to.
I wanted
Set her up.
We're out.
Just
Speed. Frank, could you describe from a kid's perspective what you saw happening that moment when you knew that the evictions were going to happen?
Well, like I said, we got in the car and went up onto the bridge, and we were going to go to the Capitol, and they were going to demonstrate there en masse. And when we started across the bridge, on the other side was the Army with Douglas MacArthur there. There were soldiers on horseback, and there were soldiers standing on the ground with their rifles with fixed bayonets and tanks. And this is the first time that I ever saw that many soldiers, live soldiers. I seen a picture of my father's Army outfit when it one taken and framed hung in our house. And of course, being a youngster and being small, those tanks looked awfully large. Today, being almost 6 foot tall, they wouldn't seem near as bad as they did then. But it was a frightening experience. It really scared the hell out of me. I knew that there was something amiss, and I had no control over, and I didn't know what my father was going to do, and luckily it worked out for the best. My father turned around and went back, and we left.
Now, what was your mother's reaction? What did she scream?
Well, knowing my mother, when we started across the bridge and she saw those soldiers, I can imagine, I'm not sure that this is her exact words, but I would imagine she says, "Oh my God, Frank, what are you going to do?" And knowing my father, that's all he needed. He probably says, "I'll drive right through the bleeps." So, and he would have tried, I think. He was that type of person. He had a cause, and he decided that he was going to see it through to the end. Luckily for us, my mother persuaded him to think otherwise.
Okay, let's cut. We're done. Frank, how did you know beforehand that you would be evicted? What happened?
My father had been away, and he came back to the tent, and he was talking to my mother, and I overheard them talking, and he was saying that they were going to march on the Capitol, but there was a chance they were going to call out the Army and have the Army come down and disperse the bonus Army people and have them leave town. And of course, my mother, when she heard this, she became excited and didn't know what was going to happen. I guess, but that was it. They knew that they were going to call out the Army, and they were going to stop them from showing a mass of bonus Army people at the Capitol, and they were going to put a stop to it. And they felt pretty sure that it was going to happen, and the way things turned out, it really did, and that was it.
Okay, you want to
Mark it.
Frank, could you describe that photo once again?
This is a picture of our family. My father's standing there next to my mother, and my sister Virginia is next to her. I'm in the middle. And my sister Margaret, Ethel, brother Howard, and my sister Ruth. And that's the sign that my father had made up, and it states that we're from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it states that this is 6 reasons for my wanting the bonus.
Okay, Eric, come on over and take a look at this.
Just describe that photo.
This is a photograph of the family when we went to Washington, D.C. It was made up as a postcard. You see my father my mother next to him, and my sister Virginia, and of course I'm in the center. My sister Margaret, Ethel, brother Howard, and my sister Ruth. And of course in the front is the sign that says Pittsburgh, PA, and here's my 6 reasons why I want the bonus.
Okay, now, sir, could you just flip the card over, and just so you can read it?
This is the thing they had printed on the back of it, which is the 23rd Psalm.
third slide?
Okay, now just talk about that, just move your hand. This is the postcard or something like that my father made up?
This is the postcard that my father made with the family standing out in front of the tent with the sign in front of us.
Okay, now
And-
could you flip it over to the other side?
And on the back, he had printed the words, the 23rd Psalm, which he injected the words of Hubert